Why groups for sexual trauma? Probably one of the most common things I hear from survivors: nobody understands me. I'm alone in this. Nobody really gets it. Even my close friends don't get it. Even my partner doesn't get it. So, as scared as they are to come into a group, suddenly here they are sitting in a room with other people who actually get it on a level. And they're free to talk about this thing that they carry stigma about in a room with other people who are gonna not just get it, but also sympathize. And it starts to normalize their experiences. It starts to normalize their reactions. It starts to normalize their thoughts, their feelings, their behaviors over the years. Okay? So this is one of the main reasons I feel group is really valuable for survivors. There's a way also in which it helps folks to become advocates for themselves. Survivors have a tremendously hard time speaking about their own needs or even knowing what they need. And so coming into group, which is scary, and talking about their trauma and talking about their struggles and then receiving that support from each other, they start to become able to speak more confidently about themselves, about their story. Some of them claim their survivorship. One guy who just is completing the men's group I'm running now decided that he was going to go home and he was going to tell his parents. He had been hiding it from them for 20 plus years. And so he decided he was going to speak out for himself and share with his parents what had happened. So self-advocacy is huge also. They also learn to give support to each other and actually receive the support, and the support feels genuine because that other person gets it. And so for me, there's something tangible that builds in the room. You know, they talk about that forming, norming, storming, performing process in groups, and that performing, there's like something I could feel like I could reach out and touch in the room, just this connection, this bond that feels really potent. And I believe it's really about that giving and receiving support from one another. So here are some different types of groups. This is from grad school. And in a couple slides, we'll get into the different kinds of groups that I do. Psychoed is just basically providing info. There's no process. There's not really any discussion. There's a specific format. We've had, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Danny, very little success at Our Voice with just straight psychoed groups. People don't really tend to come. It was a struggle for a while to keep them going, and then we realized we need to do different kinds of groups. Process groups focuses on the dynamics in the group. Therapist is the facilitator or the referee at times. Super personal. No curriculum. Discussion group, a little more informal, personal conversation. Sometimes the therapist actually participates in the discussion to kind of keep it going or stimulate it. The process piece, I'm a little wary of that. You know, that's when it gets into like really interpersonal stuff between people. And I'm trying to like, especially with the male survivors group, I'm trying to like keep things chill and help them to feel safe enough to be in the room and not all up in each other's business about, each other's process. So I'm probably least comfortable with the process group, and it really depends on like who the clients are and what they want to get out of it. So I'm going to list the different kinds of groups that I have run and talk a little bit about each one, and then we're going to get into a curriculum that I use for the male survivors group, but can be used with any gender, or you could modify it, take it, and use it for different contexts. So male survivors group, I've been doing these since I was an intern at Our Voice. 6 to 10 folks. We usually lose 1 or 2, super normal. So I try not to start with less than 6. Really like having 2 facilitators, one to kind of lead the group, be in charge of keeping folks on point, introducing the psychoed, introducing the exercises, and then one who's kind of watching the room and watching the process and the interactions and seeing if it feels like something's getting stuck or there's a little conflict building or something. So one of us is structure, one of us is flow. We do 8 weekly meetings. That feels just long enough. I've done a little shorter, and that wasn't quite long enough. I've done a little bit longer, and I was like, man, I'm tired. I don't want to hear these guys talk any longer. Bless them. So 8 seems to be about just right, and it's a closed format, meaning that members need to come to all 8 groups. Nobody can come in late or come in and out. Sometimes we'll make an exception if somebody needs to miss one group, but if they miss one then more, they have to bow out of the group. Otherwise, it's really hard to start building that bond and that trust because you got people coming in and out, who's here, who shared what last week. This happened recently with another group that we were running. I think there were 6 or 7 groups total, and they told the participants that they could miss 2, and they just didn't really ever hit that bond because it was different people every week. I allow former group members, if they've been successful in one group, to come back and to do the next one. It's beneficial for them because they feel like they can kind of stay plugged in. It's also beneficial for the other group members because then I have someone modeling that bond that has already been created and knowing how to start reaching out and connecting with the other guys and including them. So that can be a really positive experience. And the group is a mix of psychoed and discussion, a little bit of process, but I try not to let them get too up into each other's business. Like I was saying, keep things safe. I also do what we're calling Me Too circles. Me Too movement is huge, so grateful for it, that it's moving through our culture and our country. We'll have anywhere from 3 to 8 participants. We'll limit it at 8. It's an open group, and it's just one at a time. You know, whoever comes to that group is at that group. Then some point we'll schedule another one when there's enough interest for folks who want to come. It's a straight discussion group, and it's about the Me Too movement and how it's affected the people who show up. So the folks who show up might be survivors. They might be someone who knows a survivor. They might be someone who's just blown away and inspired by the movement. It also might be someone who realized or who's been told that they did something that hurt somebody else, which is edgy. But it's been really successful for us when we make that clear at the outset that people may come with a Me Too story. They may come with an "it was me and I didn't know" story. It's been very successful for folks to acknowledge, I did this thing, I had no idea. Someone told me later, I feel awful. They won't even talk to me. I don't know how to work with this. I don't know what to do. And to have that at least acknowledged, if not actual support for them in that process, can be tremendously healing. We do set some boundaries around the stories, and we're going to not get into anatomical details. You know, we monitor the flow and the structure of the group. We have specific rules and boundaries. But also, we make it clear that this is not a therapy group. We're not responsible for people's mental health in this group. You know, we'll do what we can. We're therapists. But we're not calling this, you know, like a safe therapeutic space. And that's important to make clear. So we've been doing these maybe for about a year. And it's been a really cool experience to do something a little bit different. So there's this idea that perpetrators were all sexually offended against, and that's why they're perpetrators. It's actually not generally true, and that can be really hard for survivors, especially male survivors, when they have been sexually abused, and then they're afraid, if I admit that I'm a sexual abuse survivor, then people are going to automatically see me as a perpetrator. I had one guy who disclosed to some close friends, and their first response was, "You can't be around our children." And he was devastated. So perpetrators are twice as likely to have been sexually abused as your normal, everyday, average person. So that's it. But someone who's been offended against does not automatically go out and reoffend. And that's really important for survivors to know. It's a huge relief for guys to learn, like, oh, whew, this doesn't mean that somehow this thing's going to like take me over and I'm going to become a monster. That's the main thing we've struggled with this group, is just how to advertise it. You know, we've put it on our website and on our Facebook page, and then myself and the other counselor have advertised it. But yeah, we feel like we're not connecting in a way. The demand could be higher if people could find out about it. And we've done the circles both ways. We've done them where we do allow "it was me" stories, I was the offender, and then we've done them where we don't allow those. So when we do have "it was me" stories, we make it clear that we're going to make space for those stories. We're not going to criticize. We're not going to judge. And these aren't a place to like out somebody or call them into accountability. We're here just to listen. If somebody gets triggered, they get triggered. You know, and we'll do what we can to help take care of someone, but also stressing that piece of this isn't a therapy group, this isn't a discussion group. And there is a lot of crosstalk, like positive crosstalk, and support of one another, and like people inspiring each other, and like we're going to take it this way in our community. So that part has been very valuable, and we haven't had any negative or challenging experiences. The most challenging experience we've had was one person coming to the group, had been accused of perpetrating, was struggling with it. A bunch of people in the group knew that he had been accused of it, and he never spoke about it in group. So we were all kind of like, there's this elephant in the room, and we're waiting for it to be named, and then it didn't get named. So that's the most challenging thing that we've had happen so far. Yeah. Okay, so that's Me Too circles. Drop-in group. And this came, Angelique, as you were asking, this came out of a need for, well, what now? You know, like I've been through the group. How do I stay plugged in? And so I was doing these monthly, but then there wasn't quite the interest, so I'm going to drop to doing them quarterly. 4 to 8 participants. It's a great opportunity for these guys who have been through something to see each other again, even if they didn't keep in touch out in the world. Or guys from different groups to meet each other and cross paths. And consistently, they say, I walk in, and even though I don't know these guys, I know I'm safe. Because they understand and they've been through this group. So members have completed the 8-week men's group. 1 or 2 facilitators. I can handle it myself, but sometimes it's nice, again, to have the guy who co-facilitates with me so he can see those group members too. It's really open discussion and process. I do very little other than start us and try to keep us on track if something goes off in the weeds, and then end us on time. Alrighty. Ritual retreat. So I was joking a little bit about witches and wizards earlier. Thanks for bearing with me there. But I do believe, yeah, it's Asheville, thanks. I do believe that ritual can be really useful for moving stuff through our psyche. You know, we can even look to church, you know, with communion and confession. You know, there's ritual in most spiritual paths, and it's useful. It helps us. So I designed a ritual retreat for guys who had completed the 8-week group, and they're like, now what? We want to do deeper work. Because in the 8-week group, they're not allowed to tell their trauma story. They're not allowed to talk about what happened to them in order to keep the space safe. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So in this ritual retreat, it's Friday afternoon through Sunday afternoon. One of the focuses is they get the microphone for pretty much an unchecked period of time to tell the other guys their story or part of their story and what happened to them. We set it up so that everybody has practice with grounding, with shielding. We have some hand signals for how to put on the brakes if anybody needs to slow down a little bit. And so they're practicing not only telling their story and taking that risk and being supported, but also everybody is practicing with titration, with regulation of themselves, noticing what's happening in the room. So it's really good practice for advanced personal work. Full participation, it means they've got to be there the whole weekend. Once you're in, you're in. and we ask them not to leave, even if they get triggered, which happens. They have to have done at least one men's group and individual therapy, either with me or with another therapist that I can be in touch with. Maximum of 4. We've had, I think, 3 guys both times, and it's been a lot of work. 2 facilitators, and there's got to be a really great relationship there too. Yeah, we do it at this place called Laughing Waters, which is also in Black Mountain. It's a retreat center. They donate the space to us, which is amazing. So yeah, we show up Friday. The guys bring their food, which is already prepared. So we're not spending a bunch of time cooking and things. And then we don't keep them up all night doing ritual. Everybody gets to sleep. But we're working Friday night, Saturday, all through the night. They sleep Saturday night, and then Sunday we do work through about noon. 13 and up is our voice. Yeah. We had a 16-year-old who's done the men's group twice, and he wanted to do the retreat, but after we talked, he realized he wasn't quite ready. So we would do it with a teenager if they were ready. So the ritual work looks like this. Friday night we show up, we check in, we talk about the whole weekend, what we're going to be doing. We eat together, and then Friday night they do an art exercise. We bring collage, clay, markers, paint, fabric, all kinds of stuff, and they make a totem to represent the abuse. And we make it clear this isn't a voodoo doll. We're not doing black magic on anybody, but we are going to destroy these totems. And so we want you to put as much of what you remember and as much of what you feel you're still carrying into this totem. So they take some time and they make their totems, and then we get together and each one of them has an opportunity to talk about it. You know, what does this totem mean to you? What was it like making it? It's really great to start involving the artistic side, you know, the unconscious side, as it were, in the formation of this work. So they each have an opportunity to talk about the totem. And then we put them in a boundaried space, you know, so that energy is going to stay contained for the weekend. And then we go out to the river and do some discharge, just letting go of any intensity that's built up. Saturday, we get up and we start the processing. You know, we go over the shields up, grounding, that kind of stuff, the titration signals. And then each guy has his opportunity to tell his story and the other guys to listen, and then the other guys to reflect and be supportive at the end of the story. That takes most of Saturday. So we really take our time with it and want to have the time for these guys to go deep. Saturday evening, they decide how they want to destroy their totems. Do they want to burn them in the fire? Do they want to bury them in the earth? Do they want to throw them in the river? So then we go out. Anything else they want to say to them or do, we process through that, and then we destroy the totem. There's a release. And then they don't know this, but then their next exercise is they have to go out in the woods and pick up a stick or a branch for every time they've crossed someone else's boundaries, sexually, emotionally, relationally. And often there's one guy who's like, do we have all night? You know? And so they'll go out and they'll collect those sticks, and we start a fire, and then they come back. If they want to say anything, they can say something, and then they burn those sticks. And interestingly, this time there was a guy, he put his handful of sticks in the fire and he started crying, and I checked in with him, you know, I said, are you okay? What's going on? And he said, I love this part. And I said, well, what do you love about it? And he said, I don't feel just like a victim. I was like, wow, so interesting. And recognizing that we can hurt other people, we're not just a victim. Super powerful. So that's Saturday night. And then Sunday we get up and we just basically do kind of a long checkout. You know, how has the weekend been for you? What has the process been like for you? Does it feel like there's anything that you're holding on to still? And then we do some reflection of each other. You know, I'm really glad you were here because you brought this great sense of peace and calm, or I really feel like I got to know you really well. Your vulnerability was really inspiring, that kind of stuff. And then we end around noon and they go on their way. And then I offer them one individual session through our voice if they're having any trouble after the retreat, just to kind of integrate. So I love doing this kind of work. Every time we do it once a year, and every time I'm like, how can I do this full time? Love this. Yeah, I would say youngest has been about 30 and oldest has been late 40s. No, 50s, mid-50s. Yeah. Most guys who come to see me are in their 40s, 30s or 40s. And I'm usually like the second person they've told. Guys wait an average of 25 years before they tell one person. And it's usually their partner. And then their partner says, you should get some therapy. And then they come and see me. I'm going to hop up on a soapbox for a minute and say that I think most diagnoses are misdiagnoses, and it's trauma is what's going on. And I'll rant about that a little bit more, a little bit later.
When we become mentally ill after something like that happens to us.
Yeah. So none of these are exclusionary, where if somebody gives me an answer that I really don't like, they can't come. Except, can you be sober on time and come to all 8 groups? That one's pretty inflexible for me. All of the others, their answer, I don't think I've gotten any answers for the other ones that were like a red flag for me. So I usually do this over the phone. I usually spend at least 15 minutes with the person, finding out a little bit more about them, how they found out about the group, that kind of thing. This is maybe a little more nerve-wracking for me than actually having them in the group. I don't know why. Maybe because it's our first contact, maybe because it's on the phone. And I also make it clear when I'm doing the screening, I let them know we're not going to be discussing trauma stories. And guys are always like, okay, cool, yeah, I'll do the group then. They don't want to talk about it. Yeah, they usually have contacted us about wanting to do the group. And so I'm making that call back or whatever and saying, hey, you're interested in the group. Just want to talk to you about it. Here's the format, 8 weeks, blah, 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 not sharing trauma stories, blah, blah, blah. And then I have some questions for you. But yeah, usually our voice is a support. Sometimes they have a therapist, sometimes they have an individual therapist that referred them to the group. But yeah, I try to make it clear, group can stir some things up. What kind of support do you have while we're doing this? Sometimes they want to start seeing me individually if they're not. But a lot of them come out of individual therapy with me. I tell them, hey, I also do this group. Are you interested? And they're like, we're not going to talk about trauma stories. Oh, okay, well, maybe. All right. Most guys want a male therapist because they don't want to talk about the stuff. They're less comfortable talking about it with a woman. I haven't explored so much why, but I've had one guy say, I've got this therapist who's this older woman. I can't tell her what happened to me. It'd be like telling my grandmother. Like, I just can't. Yeah. But yeah, whether or not and most of the guys that come have had mostly male perpetration, but they still want a male therapist. So moving on from the exercise, I just wanted to throw up a flyer that we've been using for a while. Is that legible to y'all in the back? Not so much. So just as an example, strong graphic to catch the eye. Tabs along the bottom with the phone number, and we'll usually tear 1 or 2 off when we put the flyer up. Yeah, nobody has to be the first one. So at the top it says 1 in 6 men, that's an eye catcher. And then it says have experienced unwanted or abusive sexual experiences before age 16, and 1 in 10 rape victims are male. So that normalizes it, okay? And we call it unwanted or abusive sexual experiences because that broadens the framework, right? It includes that weird thing my aunt did when I was in the bathtub or whatever. Men's group, starting end of April, Tuesday evenings for 8 weeks. So generally when it is, but we don't give the specifics because we want to screen folks first. Coping skills, trauma education, boundary setting, community. So this is why we're doing the group. Okay, and then it says we will not be sharing personal abuse stories. So guys know straight up, okay, I don't have to go and talk about what happened to me. Our Voice logo for more information. The phone number is there too. Haven't gotten any negative feedback on the flyer. We do catch a few every time we have the group from flyers. We have a list of all these different places, like cigar shops, gyms, comic book stores, record stores, stuff like that, where volunteers go and put them up. So just one example of a way to promote a group. So first group meeting sets the tone. So how we enter the room and how we present ourselves informs the culture for the group. So for me, it's about respect for the group members, respect for the courage that it takes to show up, respect for the struggles that they've had, respect for the work that they want to do. So really important. First off, I always acknowledge their courage in showing up. With the men's groups, and that's mainly what I'm going to talk about today, just using examples because it's most of what I've done. Everybody's scared walking in that first night. It's cute, actually. So I have them fill out some paperwork. The other person is welcoming them. I'm in the room having conversation as they finish the paperwork, trying to keep things, just kind of relaxed. They're all scared. And then when we start the group, I acknowledge their courage and normalize the nervousness. I say, everybody's nervous usually when they show up. I'm nervous too, normalizing that. And then we talk about the intentions for the group, just so that's set. Boom, this is what we're here to do. We're going to develop skills and tools to cope with your symptoms. We try to focus on that every meeting. There will be a piece of psycho-ed, there will be a sharing exercise, and there will be a coping skill. We want to discover commonalities and shared experience. I talk a little bit about how in every group, everybody walks in scared, but then the first group, they walk out like, wow, here I am in a room with a bunch of other people who've had a similar experience. This thing I felt alone with my whole life, now suddenly I'm not alone with it. It's powerful. And then also to learn about how sexual trauma affects us, how it affects our nervous system, how it affects our behaviors, how it affects our emotions and our minds. So those are the intentions for the group. I'm having them fill out informed consent for group work, and then there's something called the participation agreement. Man, I should have brought that as a handout too. And the participation agreement basically says, I agree to attend all 8 groups, to be on time, to be sober. I understand that it's open to anyone who identifies or presents as male, and basically agrees to the different agreements that we're going to go over in a few slides. And then the other is just a standard informed consent that every mental health agency should use. All right, so creating the culture, here are a few different things that I do. As much as possible, I use we language instead of saying you or talking about survivors. I am also a survivor, and I have found that I've played with disclosure and have found that it solidifies that relationship, that therapeutic relationship. Suddenly I'm someone who also gets it, and I'm not just sitting in my chair telling them facts and figures about survivors. So that is really useful too. I understand that, not everybody's comfortable using that disclosure therapeutically. I respect where you're coming from. I was concerned about it, but the more I used it, both in individual and in group therapy, the more effective I found it to be, especially for creating the culture and creating the bond. In the very first group where I was an intern, and there was another counselor facilitating the group with me, we had the topics going, and then one of the guys straight up asked, he said, I want you all to participate. I want to know where you land on these topics. And so we started participating. And I generally have found that the guys want that in the group. For every topic, they want us to share. And again, it's the same thing of playing like, okay, I might not open myself up and go way down into my own dark, deep well about the topic, but I'm going to share genuinely maybe about something that I've struggled with. It's a delicate balance, but I've also found that helps to increase that bond and that connection that can make for a really strong group. And I also, it's really important to set and uphold really firm boundaries, I believe, have a really strong container especially for these dudes who seem to really relish that there's a strong container and that they know exactly where the lines are, and they're going to know if they cross over one of the lines. So I also weave a lot of mindfulness in. We'll talk just a little bit about this because we've got a little over an hour left. I want to be sure we get to everything. So what is mindfulness? Mindfulness is basically noticing what's happening, paying attention to what's happening. Often survivors are kind of checked out of what's happening in their bodies, or our attention is so much on our thoughts, our self-critical thoughts, that's all we're really mindful of, and we're fused with that. So we talk a little bit about the neurophysiology of trauma, and we use mindfulness to become aware of what's happening. When we're traumatized, our nervous system gets dysregulated, right? The fight-flight part of our brain, the midbrain, that's our emotions, sensations, etc., and the back part of our brain, what they call the reptilian, which is heart beating, breathing, sweating, that kind of stuff, gets dysregulated. And not just when we're being traumatized, that extends out until we get healing for these parts of our brains through somatic therapy or some other non-talk therapy. And so it's important for these guys to become mindful of what's happening. Oh, wow, I'm noticing my heart is starting to beat really fast. That means I'm on an upswing into anxiety, or like, oh, my hands are starting to go numb. That means I'm starting to check out of my body. So mindfulness is an important component. I'll say a little bit more later when we get into the curriculum itself. But we do a lot of kind of checking in with what's happening inside to bring that awareness. And then with that awareness, folks are able to have a little more autonomy over what's happening. We can't control our emotions, but we can have some influence. We can't control our thoughts, but we can have some influence. And so mindfulness brings some autonomy and some self-empowerment there. Acceptance and commitment therapy basically teaches that most of our psychological suffering comes either from what they call avoidance or fusion. Avoidance is where we're like, I'm not looking at that, I'm not feeling that, I'm not touching it. And fusion is where we're so fused with something we can't get any distance from it. Like, I'm such a piece of crap, I can't believe I said that. Jane is never going to trust me again. Okay? And so with ACT, again with the mindfulness, we're trying to notice, when I'm stuffing something down, or notice when I'm consumed with something and find that healthy middle ground. That's psychological flexibility. And so that's one of the things we're trying to help the guys with too. So I draw a lot from ACT in my group culture. We start and end every group just with a minute of silence, just to take some breaths and get present and notice what's happening inside of us. All right, first meeting is about setting what I like to call the agreements. If we call them rules, then we're already starting with power over language. Okay? So I like to call them agreements, and I like to, I've been just doing this recently, frame them as rights. Rather than saying this is a rule, or, often rules are no doing this, no doing that. That's early development language, So trying to frame it as rights and agreements makes it more of a collaboration, respects the autonomy and the power of the people in the room. So the first one is we have the right to confidentiality and privacy. Okay? So everything that is said in group stays in group. This is pretty standard stuff, but I'm going to go over it anyway. Membership in the group is private. That means if you see a guy from the group out in public, maybe nod and smile, but that guy and the person he's with, he may not want them to know why you know each other. Right? So while we're in group, say hi maybe, but don't talk to each other out in public. It's okay if you want to go home and share your experience of what happened in group, not what somebody else said, but you could say, somebody else in the group said this thing, not with specifics, but just said something, and then I felt or thought this, and it really spurred this for me. That's okay to share, but not okay to share somebody else's story or somebody else's experience. And please, no contact outside of group at all until after the last session. This is something that I learned kind of the hard way. where we had one guy who's particularly needy and was like asking for phone numbers and emails from other guys in the group who had trouble saying no but felt overwhelmed, and it just caused some drama, basically. So now what I do is just ask him, like, hey, you know, at the end of the group, y'all have the opportunity to become friends, to get to know each other, but for now, we're not going to have any contact outside the group.
How do you handle that if people already know each other?
If they already know each other, it's been okay so far in my experience. Yeah, if there's already a relationship. Yeah, I can't think of any time it hasn't been okay. There was, in one of the ladies' groups recently, 2 of the participants showed up and were like, they had worked to get together and knew each other. And then they talked it out and decided, like, okay, we're going to try this. Yep. We have the right to consistency. So show up on time. I'm pretty intense about this, to the point where if I feel like it's going to be an issue, I tell them the door is going to be locked at starting time. I feel like it's disrespectful to show up late to the other folks, and tolerating it a little bit, it starts to scooch more and more and more. So show up on time, be sober, come to all the groups. We do have an agreement where they can miss one. If there's like a scheduling conflict or something, that's cool. But they miss more than one, then they need to bow out of the group. We have the right to respect. There's lots of diversity in the room. There's racial diversity, there's sexual orientation, politics, hobbies, all kinds of stuff. But there's one thing that unites us, and that's sexual trauma. And so I focus on that, as the uniting piece. And so we're going to need to make room for other perspectives. If somebody's talking about something that you don't really agree with, that's their right to talk about that. And we're not going to pile on and talk about how we disagree. And generally, guys have been pretty respectful about that. Even when there's conflicting politics or something in the room. Please no crosstalk, piggybacking, or advice giving. Crosstalk is, just starting to talk out of turn, like about what's going on. And then as you were talking about, the discussion just goes off into the weeds. I try to just keep things on point. It's okay if somebody wants to support something else someone said, but piggybacking is where they just start to, well, then this happened to me. Well, I had this experience, This one is a touch and go kind of thing. I find that it's easier for guys if we have that rule really set and they're just sort of tentative. They're like, can I respond to that? Sure, respond to that, and we'll kind of titrate it and see how it goes. So I find it's best for me to start with a really strong structure and then allow it to flex and loosen a little bit. Advice giving, definitely, we don't allow this. I've been in your shoes and what I did was this and you should blah, blah, blah. It's not useful. Just not useful. We have the right to autonomy. That means basically take care of yourself. You're choosing to be here. You get to choose to be here. If you need to get up and use the bathroom, get up and use the bathroom. If you need a drink of water, step outside or whatever. I do ask guys if they're going to go out and use the bathroom to give me a thumbs up so I know everything's cool and they're not super triggered and don't need support. They also have the right to pass. If there's a topic and we're going around, they have the right to not contribute if they don't want to. We had one guy who came, and that's mostly what he did. It was challenging for him just to be in the room, but that was his growth edge, and that's what he did, and that was okay. We have the right to support and to safety. No sharing of trauma stories. We've talked about that and talked about why. I asked for permission to facilitate and put on the brakes, just like I did at the beginning of our workshop here. And we make it clear, please ask before, reaching out a hand for a handshake or going for a hug. Some guys don't want any physical contact at all. And I'm still working on that too. If I laugh at something, I have a tendency to slap someone's knee next to me. So I'm working on that too. I acknowledge that and let them know if they're sitting next to me. I'm still working on it. I've watched someone dissociate in group, and that was kind of scary.
How did you handle that?
Let it ride, because in a way, folks need to be able to ask for support, and there's a line between like giving someone support and then putting like the whole group attention on them, like a spotlight. And so what ended up happening is that person ended up leaving, and the co-facilitator went out and helped them. Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. You know, there's a question for us, like how much are we responsible for the group participants' internal state? You know, like we're responsible for them in a sense. We're responsible for their safety. We're responsible for their well-being, but they have a responsibility too. And where is that line? You know, what I'll do is start. When we do the check-in, I'll say, what are you walking in with? A few sentences, not a whole novel. We don't need to hear about your oil change today. And kind of set that as a tone. And then there have been a few times when guys have kind of gone on and on. I try to leave some room, but when the room starts checking out, I'll just say, okay, let's bring it back on topic. You know, that's one of the things I ask for permission about, is to guide and facilitate and, you know, bring us back on topic. So I don't have a timed share. It's more kind of feeling what's happening in the room, and is somebody boring everybody else to death. So usual group agenda, just about every group, this is what we move through. We start with the quiet breaths to get present. We do a check-in. You know, in the first group, it's your name and one hope or concern you have for the group. If it's the next group, it's, you know, what stuck with you from our last group? What did you notice during the week? Keep it relevant and on point. Then I'll introduce the topic, which we'll get into with the curriculum in a slide or two. I'll provide a little psychoeducation if that's appropriate. Then we'll have a round of sharing where they get to talk about their experience of the topic. So it's boundaried, but they get to share personally, and that's where the work starts to happen. They start to hear each other's similar experiences. I'll introduce the relevant coping skill. We'll practice that. We might have a round of feedback on that. And then we'll do the checkout, which is, you know, what really stuck out to you from group today? What are you walking away with? And believe it or not, this takes about an hour and a half to 2 hours. Sometimes it's a little shorter, the first couple groups, to get the guys talking. I might throw another question or two in there to kind of get things moving or get them juicy. Sure. So they're welcome to talk about how the trauma has affected them, and that's the basis. With the no trauma stories, what we say is, you know, no details of what happened. Sometimes somebody might say, you know, it was my cousin, or somebody might say, I was 7 years old, but that's it. But it is okay to talk about how it's impacted you. Sometimes we'll have to put the brakes on, I forget what they call it in AA, but like war stories or something like that. Yeah. This one time I was so drunk and I blah, 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 you know. There have been a few, and we'll talk about some of these challenges in group towards the end too, some things that can come up and how to work with them. So we're going to go through the topics. We're not going to visit all of them because we don't have time, but I'll talk a little bit about some of them. So this is the 5 F's. And what I'll do is actually print these out on sheets of paper so that they can be sort of like a set of cue cards. You've probably heard of fight or flight. There's also freeze, fawn, and fiend. Okay? And what the trauma field is discovering is that these trauma reactions extend out long-term through our lives so that they inform our behavior when we're stressed or when we're triggered. So if our primary response is the fight response, we're going to respond to stressors with anger and intimidation, power games, control. Okay? If we tend toward the flight response, we're going to trend towards anxiety, panic, rigidity, perfectionism. if it's the freeze response, which is where everything just shuts down and we go numb to survive trauma. This happened to me. I grew up right outside the west side of Chicago. I got mugged and was being repeatedly punched in the face, and I just stood there. I couldn't move. My whole body was just frozen. That's the freeze response. Long term, it looks like depression and dissociation and withdrawal. The fawn response is a kind of Stockholm syndrome. This is where, in order to survive the trauma, we become subservient to the perpetrator. We fawn over them. Their needs become more important than ours. And so long term, this looks like codependence. It looks like people who have poor boundaries, who are always at the service of others. Somebody was asking about this earlier. Folks others' needs are way more important than their own. The fiend response, I think, is particular to sexual trauma, but it could happen with other types of trauma, I suppose. This is where, when we're young and our nervous systems aren't equipped to handle sexual experiences, our nervous system gets super stimulated. And so this kind of high buzz becomes what feels normal, and then any drop in it feels dangerous. It feels like I'm just going to fall into the abyss. And so folks with the fiend response tend to go out seeking risks, stimulation, porn, gambling, substance use, compulsive sex, all kinds of stuff like that.